I was 5 years old in 1973, and although I have no memory of the Yom Kippur that began 50 years ago tonight, I think it's essential to experience this year's Yom Kippur through a lens focused on that Yom Kippur in 1973. It was on that Yom Kippur, of course, that Israel was attacked by a coalition of Arab armies led by Syria and by Egypt, the Yom Kippur War. Israel was unprepared. The country came close to being overrun by its enemies. Israel prevailed, of course, or else we would be living in a very different world. But the price of that war was the most severe of any war since the Independence War. 2,656 soldiers were killed, some 12,000 injured, and hundreds more were captured and tortured. Israel suffered a trauma and a disillusionment with itself that has never healed and from which it has never fully recovered. I would suggest that it was not just Israel, as nothing is just Israel. The collective Jewish people was impacted and remains so. I was able to hear from many of you over the course of the last week, sharing your thoughts and memories of this year, of this evening 50 years ago. So I'd like you all to take a moment to think back to your memories of Yom Kippur 50 years ago. Or if you're like me, a little too young to recall, then revisit what you know about that day from history class in Hebrew school. Kol Nidre in 1973 was a Friday night, October the 5th. That Kol Nidre was probably like any other Kol Nidre for you and for the 2,656 Israelis for whom this would be the last Kol Nidre. It was a Kol Nidre like any other for Jews everywhere, including here. Jews whose heads were held high in the post-Holocaust reality, because finally, after 2,000 years, we have a state of our own. In the post-Six-Day War reality, knowing that we can proudly defend ourselves. Where were you that Yom Kippur day, October the 6th? Do you recall the moment that you heard Israel was attacked? I'm told that here at Temple Sinai, the facility manager, Carl Pileski, who lived in the basement apartment downstairs, came up here into the sanctuary after seeing the attack mentioned on the news and whispered to Rabbi Strassfeld on the bima. Rabbi Strassfeld interrupted services to inform you all that a bitter war had begun. So this Yom Kippur is the anniversary of that awful war 50 years ago. I think it's important to speak tonight on our Kol Nidre Eve about that war, not only to commemorate the 50 years, but because how we remember the Yom Kippur War is in several ways a paradigm for what we do on Yom Kippur in general. Cheshbon HaNefesh. Cheshbon HaNefesh is literally settling scores with your own being, or taking accountability of your soul. It's introspection, looking in the mirror of yourself, of your thoughts, your words, your deeds, to see who you've become, and then to look into your eyes and to ask yourself whether this is the person that you really want to be. For 50 years, Israel has been doing this cheshbon nefesh, obsessed over the questions of what went wrong, where did we fail, what were the mistakes that led to that disastrous war. As I said, the war remains an open wound in Israeli society. Major questions are still asked about what were the primary and secondary failures and mistakes, who knew what and when, where were the breakdowns in the military leadership and the political leadership in society as a whole. Challenges are lobbied against the persisting ethos and self-image of Israel and Israeliness that might have led to failures and could threaten us again, God forbid. Just a couple of weeks ago, all the documents from the war were declassified. Scholars continue to research and debate. As we do our own cheshbon nefesh this Yom Kippur, as we search our souls to account for failures and mistakes of the past year, we do so without excuses or justifications. We want to take a long look in the mirror, an honest look. We say, Ashamnu, we were wrong. We are responsible as individuals and as a society. And so often, those failures are, in the big picture of our lives, due in some way to four things. Number one, to our hubris. That's to say, our lack of humility, to our assuming or pretending that we are invulnerable. Hubris is our overconfidence and overestimation of our abilities and our stature, by which we ignore our limits and our boundaries. Number two, not facing up to the consequences of our actions. Thirdly, due to the breakdown of trust in national leadership, triggered by its own and society's narrowness, self-interest, and division. And our fourth area, a failure due to the promises we make but fail to keep, which is the focus of the Kol Nidre prayer with which we began this evening's service. These are all very human failures, ones that I think we can all relate to. These are the same failures that most scholars say were at the heart of all that went wrong for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. For the greatest part of our kids' childhood in Israel, we lived on a moshav just outside Jerusalem, renting a small house on a property of our landlords, Yiftach and Orna Zemer. We were there for about 7 or 8 years. These were the most decent landlords we have ever had, kind people, honest people. We loved our little college and our life on the moshav. Yiftach and Orna were parents of acquaintances of ours, grandparents of my oldest Yami's best friend from preschool. While we were there, Yiftach retired as a pilot for El Al, and he started to spend more time caring for his horse there on the property and gardening. I was surprised to see Yiftach's picture in the Israeli newspaper a week ago, Thursday, in an article discussing a new documentary film. The documentary is a 4-part series aired this past week on Israel's main public TV station in light of this commemoration of the war. The headline of the article was, quote, "I've carried this with me for 50 years. The documentary is riveting, but also haunting. It looks at the experience of the war for Israel from the perspective of Israel's most elite Air Force unit of the time, Squadron 201, nicknamed Ha'achat, the One, which was the first squadron of Phantom F-4 fighter jets in the Israeli Air Force. Yiftach was the squadron commander. I knew he'd been an Air Force pilot, but I had no idea that this very humble, down-to-earth, next-door neighbor had been the commander of Israel's most elite Air Force unit. Maybe the Israeli equivalent of like the pilots from the movie Top Gun, only real and really legendary, not just in Israel, but at that time around the world as well. For the sin of hubris, Ashamnu. Dan Chalutz was a member of that unit, who would later become the IDF chief of staff. He describes the pilots in that squadron as feeling that they were Malkei Hashamayim, kings of the sky. They felt invincible. Recall that it was the Air Force that dominated the skies to win the Six-Day War in 1967. The bravado of the Air Force, of the entire IDF, and of the country as a whole was perpetuated by the military and the political leadership. An offer of peace from Sadat's Egypt in 1971 had been dismissed without serious diplomatic attention. Numerous intelligence reports noticed suspicious activity in the lead up to the war. Soldiers reported large troop movements across the borders, but the leadership did not believe that our superiority would dare be challenged. Later in the film, Dan Chalutz describes the feeling after Squadron 201 lost the first of the 7 pilots and navigators who died in the war, and some of the other 14 who were captured after having to parachute from damaged planes over enemy territory. For the first time, he says, I understood we are flesh and blood, that we don't have any special blue blood running through us. We bleed like anyone else. The pendulum swung from hubris to vulnerable, from kings of the sky to mere flesh and blood human beings. What a terrible cost to have to pay for the illusion of being something we are not, for being blind to our own vulnerabilities. For the sin of not facing up to consequences, ashamnu. The documentary's telling of the Yom Kippur War story begins nearly 8 months before the war itself, on February 21st, 1973. The pilots say that's when it all began. Yiftach had been the commander of Squadron 201 for nearly 2 years already. The pilots interviewed take pains to describe Yiftach's leadership as fatherly, what a mensch he was, how calm and cool-headed, never angry or saying ill of anyone. Exactly our own experience of Yiftach. The man has not changed. Elite pilots asked to join the squadron so that they could serve under him. On February 21st, 1973, a Libyan airline civilian jet en route from Tripoli to Benghazi and then Cairo got lost in a terrible sandstorm. Its instruments were dysfunctional, and it entered Israeli airspace over the Sinai. Israeli jets were scrambled, led by the squadron commander, Yiftach Zemer. Efforts to signal the airline pilots and indicate for them to follow the Israeli Phantoms toward a landing failed. At first, the Libyans followed and they lowered their landing gear, but then they retracted the wheels and started to turn back towards Egypt. The Israeli pilots were unable to determine if civilians really were aboard or not. All the shades were drawn in the passenger section. The suspicion by the Air Force top brass was that the plane could be on a suicide mission targeting Israel's nuclear reactor at Dimona. And even though by this point the plane was now heading back to Egypt and was no longer a threat, the thinking went, it's good to send the message that we Israelis are not normal. Don't mess with us. The order came to down the aircraft while it was still over Israeli territory. Yiftach describes his gut feeling that this was a mistake. He asked for more time, another try to signal the jetliner's pilots. He's thinking, this pilot just went off course. What do you want from him? The order came back. Down the plane now, down it. Yiftach recalls the strain and the torture of his situation. Was this an illegal order that ethically he was obligated to resist, or a legitimate order that he had to fulfill? He wonders whether and at what point one's gut feeling or sense that there's still a chance for a different outcome, the right thing to do, outweighs the very clear and direct command from the head of the Air Force. He tried to signal the pilot again, no response. He fired the first shots. 108 innocent civilians died, 6 survived. Yiftach states in the film that, in general, pilots are privileged fighters. They don't have to see the human consequences of what they do with their weapons. They don't see the blood or the dead or the suffering of the wounded. The sky continues to be beautiful up there. The brutality down below remains unseen. After the airliner was shot down, Yiftach took it upon himself to go to the hospital where the surviving Libyans were being treated. He says it was like stepping into Dante's Inferno. I won't describe it the way he does, the sights, the sounds, the smells of the suffering. No one was blaming Yiftach. The government justified the action. Yiftach himself had not had to actually give the order. There was no requirement to go to the hospital, no press to pose for, no reason to examine it any further. But he passed on the privilege of ignoring the consequences of his actions. He chose to look at those consequences up close and not from 30,000 feet above. This is cheshbon hanefesh. He says that going to the hospital that day was a turning point in his life. It started there, he says. For the sins of failed leadership, ashamnu. Yiftach's sense that he had to question the order to shoot down the plane, his struggle between his own sense of right and wrong, his ability to assess what is going on, his instincts and judgment, unable not to question the morality of the leaders upon whom he is supposed to rely, would echo far and wide in the war narratives. On so many levels, there was broken trust and failures of leadership. I have no doubt that, whatever your politics are, most of us sense a critical threat of broken trust and failing leadership in our society today, and certainly in Israeli society today, as I discussed on Rosh Hashanah. For the sin of unkept promises, Ashamnu. Yiftach's wife, Orna, was similarly kind and wonderful to have as a landlord and a neighbor. I'll always remember a night in the summer of 2014. We found ourselves in the shared bomb shelter, which was a concrete basement under the house. This was during one of those mini wars fought with Gaza over the last 15 years or so, the result, at least in part, of the strategic decision by Israel's leadership to, quote, manage the conflict ongoingly, rather than to seek a negotiated end to it. That particular round of fighting began after 3 Israeli teenagers were kidnapped and murdered. Rockets were being fired towards Jerusalem. There we were, sirens having gone off, waiting for either a boom, which we didn't really expect, or after some time to go back inside our houses. We were talking. It seemed ironic, I told Orna, to be there in a bomb shelter with her, recalling how years before she had told us about when her first child was born. It was during the War of Attrition, really the continued fighting along the Suez Canal after 1967. Yiftach was there flying missions. Orna had gone to the hospital alone to give birth to a healthy baby boy, Rui. It was 5 days before Yiftach could be replaced in the squadron and get back home. The first thing Orna said to Yiftach when he arrived, quote, by the time this child grows up and turns 18, we will not have wars or an army to have to go to. That newborn, Rui, became a pilot too. That night in the bomb shelter, Orna thought quietly for a moment and said, the truth is, she didn't believe that anymore. No parent any longer can say in good faith that their kids will not have to fight one day. She wondered what it does to a society to have to admit to itself that they cannot make peace for their newborn children to live in, that they as parents cannot promise to make a world in which their children won't possibly be sent off to a war. Like Orna, seemingly all Israeli parents at that time clung to their new babies and the baby boom that naturally followed the war, and they made that promise again. By the time this child grows up and turns 18, we will not have wars or an army to have to go to. In the mid-1990s, those babies were now soldiers themselves. The Army entertainment troupe at the time, representing their peers, sang a song that opened with the words, Anachnu Yeladim Shel Choref 73. We are the children of that winter in the year 73. They sang about the promise their parents made but did not keep. The song ends with an offer from the children to help their parents, the generation who lived through the Yom Kippur War, which was now leading the country in 1995, to join together, children and parents, to fulfill the promise. We sang the words of Kol Nidre 3 times earlier this evening. It's about the great challenge we have to begin the year anew, a new year full of potential, of promise, yet knowing we made vows last year that we failed to keep. On this Kol Nidre evening, I think of this song, whose melody is both loving and yet haunted by sadness. Maybe think of it this evening as a 4th refrain of the Kol Nidre. We are the children of winter 1973. You first dreamt about us at dawn when the battles ended. You were tired men who thanked their good luck. You were worried young women, and you wanted so much to love. When you conceived us with love in winter 1973, you wanted to fill up with your bodies what the war left empty. And when we were born, the country was wounded and sad. You looked at us, you hugged us. You were trying to find comfort. When we were born, the elders blessed us with tears in their eyes. They said, "We wish these kids will not have to go to the army." And your faces in the old pictures prove that you said it from the bottom of your hearts when you promised to do for us everything to transform an enemy into a loved one. You promised a dove, an olive branch. You promised peace at home. You promised spring and blossoms. You promised to fulfill promises. You promised a dove. We are the children of winter 1973. We grew up, and we're now in the army. With our weapons and helmets on our heads, we too know how to make love, to laugh, and we know how to cry. We too are men, we also are women, and we too dream about babies. This is why we will not pressure you. We will not demand of you, and we will not threaten you. For when we were young, you said, promises must be kept. If strength is what you need, we will give it. We won't hold back. But we just wanted to whisper. We are the children of that winter in the year 1973. You promised a dove, an olive branch. You promised peace at home. You promised spring and blossoms. You promised to fulfill promises. You promised a dove. On this Kol Nidre night, may we be humble and recognize our vulnerabilities, so our outlook on the world is calibrated with reality. May we face up to the consequences of our actions. May we demand accountability and trustworthiness from our leaders. May we insist that unity, values, and the national good, absent political interests, guide them. And let us remember that we are never absolved personally of what we demand of our leaders. Finally, may we never give up hope or stop working to fulfill a promise to our children and grandchildren that we will leave them a better world to live in, a healthier world, an environmentally sustainable world, a world with political and social stability, a world of freedom, a world of opportunity, a world at peace. Gemar Chatima Tova.